Hi guys, welcome back. So today I want to go more in depth into writing an opening scene. So what I've done so far is I wrote the beginning stage of what could be the opening scene for my future storyline, and now what I want to do is to basically use some theory and techniques that I've come across to try to craft it into an actual opening scene that is engaging and interesting and also thematically fits in with the rest of the story. And so I made a bit of checklist of what I want to go through today and what I want to improve in terms of the opening scene. The first thing that I want to look at are different opening types and basically how they have different functions for different stories, and maybe get a sense of if this is the best starting point for this story, and also what elements are present in other opening types that might be more interesting to add to whatever opening I want to write. And then I want to go through two techniques from Anatomy of Story. The first one is about creating an opening scene. So there's a scene construction technique in here, gives you details on how to craft your opening basically. And then there's another technique about first lines and how to find the best first line for your story. So I think those two are really applicable techniques that are going to be fairly interesting to put into action. Let's get started. So what I mean with opening types are when you look at especially movies and TV shows, there it's very distinct that there are different opening types, right? So for example, if you look at like Attack on Titan, you have like this flash forward technique where you start at a high point, critical moment, and then just before this moment plays out, you cut back to earlier in the day and then you start introducing the protagonist. Or better example for a TV show where it's long term is How to Get Away with Murder. There they flashed forward to an episode that was the midpoint finale. So basically they went to that moment, showed you how dramatic that moment would be. You have kind of like this opening of those four law students who are trying to bury a body. Before that scene fully plays out, it goes, I think, several weeks earlier and then starts introducing the protagonist, and we're basically left with the question of, okay, so how did these characters end up here? And in Attack on Titan, the opening is basically how does this scene play out, which is resolved within the first episode. So that's one opening type that I considered to look at because I personally really like it. I can't really think of an example where I've seen it in novel form, but from the technique itself, it should work in novel form as well, and I'm sure there are some examples. So if you can think of a good one, definitely let me know. I would be interested to see what it looks like in written form from someone who's professionally doing this. But basically, I wrote a bit of an example of what it looked like in my story. So here what you can see, you have the protagonist in an action scene where basically this is a sort of horror supernatural mystery, right? And the main antagonist is going to turn out to be some alien creature. So it's a monster horror story, or it's supposed to be one. And because of that, obviously the main antagonist and also the most critical moment would involve this creature. So here it would be kind of like the reveal that this creature exists and the first time the protagonist comes face to face with it. And here basically you have the protagonist being confronted by two soldiers or some military people who basically live in a different country and who were trying to keep the protagonist out of a secured area. And when this confrontation happens, these two have already been infected, and now the effects of the creature shows itself live to the protagonist. And the idea is to have this scene play out where the protagonist is now the new target of those creatures, and just before we see how it plays out and basically what is going on and so on, you go with 6 weeks earlier and then you start with the opening mystery. The idea of this opening type is really to give the reader this promise, hey, this is going to be worth your time, this exciting scene is about to happen right from the start, so that you basically force them to stay around at least as long to get the answer to that one scene that they want. And a bit of a best practice that I saw in some of the examples that I listed is that if you do it right, you can basically use the time where you flash back and create the character introduction and so on, to give the reader all the necessary information so that when the scene plays out again, this time the stakes are even higher. So for example, in Attack on Titan, when the scene first starts, it's just kind of like, where are we, what is going on, what is this weird Titan creature looming over these walls. And the second time when we come to this moment, we know that there are a lot of Titans outside of the walls. We know that the walls have stood there for 100 years. We know that the protagonist is frustrated with being locked in basically for the rest of his life. We know that some people have gone outside and seen the devastating effects of them coming back on the same day that they went outside. So a lot of the stakes have been risen during the time that we got those crucial bits of information, where we now know when this moment plays out, it's going to be even worse than we first might have thought it would be. And that's something that I really like about this opening technique, is that it gives you the chance to do this kind of stuff. I really like how this technique can be so effective, even though it's a bit of a cheap trick in terms of, you know, kind of like trying to hook them. But if you are really good at using this spare time in between, you can really heighten the story even more than just having this opening hook. The downside with this opening type when it comes to my story is probably that you go and you give the reader right away the information of this is some sort of creature and this is what the creature does, which would completely negate the opening mystery of what happened to all those missing people, right? So the reader would already know that those missing people have probably had like suffered the same fate as those two opening characters that we saw. So then it's more about creating terror in the reader, in the sense of they know what is going on, but the protagonist doesn't, and because of that the protagonist gets into danger that the readers can't prevent from happening, right? They just have to watch. In that sense, it probably would have to be the kind of zombie outbreak opening where you know that all your readers and viewers and whatever know already that this is a zombie outbreak, but the characters don't, and so the readers are really just there watching it unfold, already knowing what it is. But as much as that would be a possibility, I think I like the idea of not giving the reader this information in terms of what the creature is and what it does at the beginning of the story, so that I can use more of this kind of suspense, kind of fear factor or uncertainty of, is this something supernatural or is it just a crime mystery where there's a logical explanation, stuff like that, to play around more with those elements. I think that would be more in tone with the story. That's why I kind of like the idea of not giving that information right away, so that I can make use of this unknown creature in its full potential for longer. So then the next opening type that I looked at more closely is to start with your protagonist. So here it's basically the idea that before anything else you introduce your protagonist and you basically give the explanation of what is the problem and what is the motivation, starting with the character and the character arc. And it comes in different forms, obviously. So there are a lot of versions where there is the backstory mixed in there as well. So for example, in Finding Nemo, there the story starts off with introducing us to Marvin and his backstory of losing his wife and how he became this overprotective father, right? So it's a bit a mix of giving us the characterization, the character arc spark through the backstory, but you can also have versions where basically it plays out in present time. And an example for this that I recently read is the All for the Game series, where basically the story starts off with the protagonist, Neil, who has this problem of he's homeless, he has a lot of backstory problems with his family and stuff, but right now in this moment when we get to meet the character, it's he has no place where he lives, he has to hide that fact from his school, and he's basically obsessed with this one sport that right now they just lost the game, and that means that their season is over, and for him this means he's not going to play again because of backstory reasons, right? So all of that backstory stuff will come into play later during the series. But the opening itself really just focuses on two factors. Basically giving us this problem that the character has right now, which is he's homeless, he doesn't have any family, he basically is pretty much lost where he's going to go with his life. And then the motivation of being obsessed with this one sport and wanting to make a career in that sport, even though when we first meet the character, that doesn't seem possible. So you basically have the character arc given to you. The story itself, the overall series, is really about found family and a sports archetype story with a lot of, like I said, backstory, kind of an umbrella plot that gives a lot of conflict that pressures in on this core story. So that's what this opening type could look like, where basically you just really start out with the character, and then as the story goes on, in my favorite examples, you will learn more of the character throughout the story. So it's really the opening mystery in many ways is the protagonists themselves. You give this problem, this motivation, so that the reader has a sense of where the character might go. But like I said, in some cases where the backstory and stuff like that and the protagonist is set up as a bit of a mystery, you don't get a lot of that early on. You get that throughout the story, and that creates those questions and this kind of progress that is really satisfying to read as you discover more about the protagonist. That being said, I really struggle with how to do this opening myself, because it's kind of the question of, so where does the character start then, right? In this sense, with Alex, the problem that he has is that there are those family expectations of him having to make this career and keeping up the family reputation, especially to not screw up things for his younger sibling who will go into the same career path. That's kind of like the problem set up. And the motivation that this character has is that he does want to do right by his family and he cares very much about doing right. He's just not good at his job. He's really just not made for this kind of life. So you have the protagonist a bit in this conundrum situation, but because the overall mystery is basically the reason why we meet this character. So if you remember, I had the mystery first, I have kind of like this setup first, and the protagonist in this case is really just the person who would be in that kind of situation, so some sort of investigator, right? So that's why in this kind of story here, I don't want to start with the protagonist in the opening in terms of just, I have written a sort of idea where I could start like in the office before Alex gets the call for this newest mystery, and within that office scene highlight kind of what his problem is, what his motivation is, and then that could be done even through the phone call, where basically you see how he's trying to avoid having to take the call, trying to avoid having to take the case, and at the same time feeling really bad because of pressure from family and from his important uncle who's also part in the department and stuff like that, right? So some sort of scene like that. But the reason why I don't want to do that is mainly because it's not really a character-centered story. As you know, the protagonist here, this character really just sticks around for 6 chapters and then the viewpoint changes, right? So there's really no point in pushing the character as the central focus right from the start, when after 6 chapters this character will die. Ideally, readers would feel some sort of horror or shock or whatever over losing this protagonist and then having to move on to a new one, right? So that's kind of feeling that would be intentional. It should feel a bit like that because it fits with what happens in the story, but they shouldn't be so attached to the opening character so that ruins the story, right? Because obviously if you started the story so strongly with your protagonist and giving kind of like those hints of a character arc, it can go negative and that would be a tragedy, right? But if it goes negative so quickly, it's really just kind of false advertisement in the opening. So like I said, obviously for your story you will have to find your own opening types that fit, and personally I'm going with my taste first of all, I think, and then with what makes sense for the story, because obviously, as you can see here, just with the opening scene for the protagonist, it's really there's nothing here, right? And I really struggled even trying to make a draft with this version just because I was so unenthusiastic about having to open like that. So what I want to do instead is basically take this kind of opening thing and what you would do in this opening and take this scene and have it happen later after the actual opening scene, and then in combination with Alex's family. So once Alex basically has this opening mystery, this case, and now the story is kicked off in terms of plot, then go over to introducing Alex in terms of his family problem and his motivation, so that those two things link in together, but it's very clear that the opening mystery is the main thing to focus on. So, and then the third opening type that I also really like when I come across it is a bit of a horror story classic opening. It's the where you start with the antagonist. Examples here, again, sorry, just movies. I just go with the examples that I can think of, but if you have novel openings that are in line with what I'm talking about here, definitely let me know. But here, two movies where I very clearly remember this kind of opening is The Dark Knight and It Follows. So The Dark Knight opens with the Joker, right, and shows us why the Joker is dangerous. And here, basically, The Dark Knight is the second movie, so we already know Batman, we already know what Batman can do in this version of the story. So basically opening the second movie with the Joker and showing very clearly how dangerous this character is a bit of almost a tie-in in this case to the first movie, and clearly positioning those two characters against each other in terms of scale. So I really liked that opening, just because obviously when you have such a strong antagonist, it really makes sense to open in that way. And the other one is It Follows, and basically what it does is it shows you what this whatever it is creature can do. So in the opening we don't see the creature, we don't even know what exactly is going on, we just see this subplot character who is running away from something invisible, and then cut to her at the beach where she's basically been killed in a very gruesome way. And this shows us right from the start something is going on here, it's really bad, and whatever it is, it's really dangerous. So then throughout the movie itself, when the protagonist finds out that she's infected and that she's being followed by this weird creature, we as the audience already know what it does when it catches up to her. So that's really a way of not giving us clear information of what the antagonist is, what it wants, or how to defeat it, but from the beginning showing us this thing is dangerous and here's why you should be afraid. And that's really the reason why I really like this opening, especially for horror stories, because it gives you that thing that you're there for right from the start without showing you all the good stuff. So it gives you the monster or the supernatural thing, whatever it is, that is basically the reason why you probably are interested in this story, but then it gives you no clear look at it. It doesn't really tell you what it does or anything like that to ruin the story. And so for this, when I tried out a draft of what that could look like, I had like two versions. So here what you can see is basically this first version here is what happened in the world, how this creature first came into the world. So the idea is basically that Alex lives in one country and there's a neighboring country that is somewhat secluded in some way, and that's the place where whatever this creature is came from originally, right? And the idea was to have it tie in a bit with this whole hunter and predator kind of theme, where you have those three hunters who went on a hunting trip who just killed some predator-like creature, in this case a cougar. I have to figure out if that makes sense for the story later on, or some other kind of predator animal, right? But just to show basically that this animal that got killed by those hunters would have been dangerous too, but obviously the top predator in this world are those hunters, and now they are being hunted by something else that they don't know. That was kind of like a bit in terms of playing more into the overall mystery, into the multiverse aspect of the story that I will come back to and will tie into overall. So kind of giving more aspects to that, fleshing out the world a bit. There's some hunting ritual being practiced in this country that is considered a tradition, but in other countries or neighboring countries they might consider it barbaric and outdated and stuff like that. There might even be kind of like a sort of conflict over that between the countries, so that when this place where this ritual takes place becomes kind of like ground zero for their infection, it might also cause more conflict and make things even worse as the whole thing starts to spread. Those are all kind of starting points that I might come back to, but that was an opening scene where I had a bit of inspiration, had some really clear idea of what I wanted it to be, and which I like overall as the starting point. So I would definitely want to keep this scene, but I don't know if I want to keep it as an opening scene. And the reason why is because it does show what the thing does. It has that almost predator element of, you know, not attacking like the weak or just children or stuff like that, but actually dangerous versions of the humans in this world, right? So it could be tying a bit into that and make it even more dangerous because of that. But then just 3 people would probably be too little for that. If I wanted to use that effect, it would be better if there was like, I don't know, a military training camp right there and they all get infected. That would basically make it much more terrifying, because then it's clear that whatever is invading this world is more than equipped to take on like the most strongest version of the humans in this world. So that's all kind of like factors that could come into play when it comes to this kind of opening, right? And that I like as such. The reason why I'm hesitant to use this opening scene is once again because it gives away a lot right from the start. Because figuring out where this infection comes from and that it starts in the neighboring country and then what exactly it is, that's basically Alex's story in those opening 6 chapters. So opening like this would give the reader right away the information of what the answer is to this overall mystery of what is going on, right? So that's definitely not what I want to do, I think. And the alternative to opening with this kind of opening type is to open with one of the other cases that happens. So before Alex gets this garden party case, he has 2 other cases where people go missing in similar weirdly circumstances. So I could also basically take the first one of this sole person, of this teenager who goes missing, and play out basically what happens to him and then end with the scene where basically this character has gone missing, right? There again, it's just giving the reader from the start the information of this is something supernatural, this is some sort of creature, and this is basically the danger that this world is in, right? Especially because if you open with this kind of scene where you have it happen to one person and then you jump over to this mystery of having 50 people going missing in the same manner, the readers will immediately know that that is what happened to those people as well. And this basically makes it clear for the reader from the beginning, this is spreading and it's spreading really rapidly. So that is an aspect that I really like, and I have to weigh it against giving the reader that kind of information to have them know right from the start what dangers the characters are in that they themselves don't know yet, so that it creates more tension, and weighing it against giving them just this opening mystery, giving them the same information as the protagonist has, and then seeing how that plays out. That creates more suspense in terms of what is going on, more driving questions. Especially if you consider that without knowing what happened to this teenager, if you have 3 cases and with each case the number of people going missing increases fairly exponentially, it should make it clear that it is spreading without having to show what exactly is going on. And then the final opening type that I basically used as the starting point when I first tried to draft an opening scene is really thrown into action. So thrown into action is basically where you start within a scene or within dialogue and you have the readers catch up. So one example would be in Jason Bourne. The novel starts on a ship within a storm and someone is shooting at someone else, and that's basically what the reader gets right from the start, and they have to catch up in terms of trying to figure out we're on a ship, we're in a storm, and 2 people are shooting at each other. Why? What is going on? So that's a way of really throwing the reader right into your story without giving them too much like information that they don't really interested in yet. Just giving them right from the start, hey, this is a story, this is the narrative, it's ongoing, it's interesting. And because the reader is already mid figuring out what is going on, they don't have as much time to really consider whether they want to continue reading or not. So that's something that you can do also for dialogue, where basically here again, I think an example is the Social Network starts like that, doesn't it? Where it starts mid-dialogue between the protagonist and his date, and basically him telling her something and she ends up insulting him. And it's kind of like the same thing where you have this sort of effect of you're on a train and you hear two people mid-conversation and you're trying to figure out what they're talking about because you had like this snippet that sounded somewhat interesting, right? The same effect. So you can either have an ongoing scene or you can either have ongoing dialogue. It's the same thing. It's really just throwing the reader in and letting them swim for themselves. I think this is kind of my most go-to opening that I really like, because I really like this thing of having to figure out what is going on, being trusted to be smart enough to figure out what is going on, and also right from the start being given the story as it's playing out and not kind of like a sort of preparation to get to the story, so that I can figure out if I like this kind of story right away. And here, what that could look like is coming back to the garden party opening scene and the mystery there, because this is basically the most interesting thing in terms of this really kicks off the events, right? So this is the inciting incident and it's a mystery, it's something weird going on, so you have like this whole effect. And instead of having the protagonist arrive at the scene and giving an explanation of all those people going missing, I think what I want to do is to start with the witness interview mid-dialogue, where already just through the dialogue exchange it should get clear to the reader that we are at the crime scene and that people have gone missing and stuff like that. And only then later on, when that part is basically done through dialogue and through show, get more into maybe then the backstory of other cases and stuff like that. And so my idea here is that I want to take the opening type of thrown into action. So starting still with this opening mystery of the garden party, starting mid-dialogue instead of giving a sort of explanation first, and then also trying to incorporate more of the effects of the creature on the missing people in terms of showing more of the details that need to be glued together. That's still very much missing in the draft that I had. And in terms of Alex himself, I think I want to take the approach of not showing clear backstory and kind of like an inciting wound incident, but rather having Alex be the kind of protagonist that you have to glue together over the 6 chapters that we get with him. But this is something that I will come back to when we are looking more into the character arc and how to shape out Alex more in detail. But for now, this is what I want to use when it comes to the opening type.